Hey everyone, welcome back to the English Dialogue, the podcast where we discuss everything related to the English language, from learning tips and grammar tricks to deep dives into culture and conversation. I'm John, your host, and today we've got a special episode lined up.
And I'm Emily. Thanks for tuning in, guys. We're so excited about today's topic because it's something that comes up a lot for English learners, the difference between what we'll call normal English and native English. We're going to explore what each term really means and how these differences can affect both language learners and native speakers.
That's right, Emily. There's a big difference between what you might learn in a textbook or classroom, what we're calling normal English, and what you'll hear in everyday conversations, which is more like native English.
Exactly. Whether you're preparing for an exam, trying to blend in with native speakers, or just want to understand movies and TV shows better, this topic is for you. So, let's jump in.
Segment 1. What do we mean by normal English versus native English?
So, to start things off, let's clarify what we mean by normal English. Basically, normal English is the version of English you learn from textbooks, language apps, or in traditional classroom settings. It tends to focus on grammar rules, formal vocabulary, and standard pronunciation. Would you agree, Emily?
Totally. Normal English is kind of like the correct version of English in a sense. It's what teachers and textbooks emphasize because it provides a solid foundation. But as we both know, language is so much more than just rules and formal speech.
Right. That's where native English comes into play. Native English refers to how English is actually spoken by native speakers in their daily lives. It includes slang, idioms, contractions, phrasal verbs, and sometimes even grammar mistakes that are actually common in casual conversation. It's not always grammatically perfect, but it's real and natural.
Yeah, and it also varies depending on the region, social context, and even the speaker's mood. A native speaker might say, "I'm going to grab some coffee," instead of, "I'm going to get some coffee." Both are correct, but the first one is what you'd usually hear in an informal setting.
That's a great example, Emily. I think it also highlights another point. Normal English tends to be more predictable. You have rules to follow and clear patterns, but native English is much more flexible and fluid.
Segment 2. Why do these differences exist?
So, let's talk about why these differences between normal English and native English exist in the first place. I think a lot of it comes down to how language is taught versus how it evolves naturally.
Definitely. Language education focuses on a standardized form of the language because it's easier to teach and test. Imagine trying to teach English to beginners if you had to include every possible slang term, accent, and regional dialect. It would be overwhelming.
Right. It's like trying to teach someone to play the piano by starting with jazz improvisation. You need to know the basics first, the scales, the notes, the chords, before you can start bending the rules or adding your own flair.
Exactly. But once you step outside the classroom, you realize that people don't always stick to those basics. For instance, in formal writing, we're taught to avoid contractions and use proper grammar. But in conversation, it's totally normal to say things like, "I ain't got time for that," or "couldn't care less," which can be confusing if you're expecting textbook English.
And even beyond grammar, there's the cultural aspect. Native English often reflects cultural references, humor, and even sarcasm that aren't always easy to translate or learn through a book. Things like, "break a leg," or "it's raining cats and dogs," wouldn't make sense to someone learning just normal English.
Segment 3. Examples in common situations.
Let's give our listeners some concrete examples of these differences. One that always stands out to me is the difference in greetings. In normal English, you might learn, "How are you?" or "Hello." But in native English, people are more likely to say, "What's up?" or even just, "Hey."
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just about the words themselves, but also the meaning behind them. For instance, when someone says, "What's up?" they're not really asking for a detailed answer. It's more of a casual greeting like, "Hi." If you respond with a long explanation of your day, it might seem a little strange.
Another great example is how people order food at a restaurant. In normal English, you might learn, "I would like to order a hamburger, please." But in native English, it's more common to hear, "Can I get a burger?" or just, "I'll have a burger."
And then there are idioms and phrasal verbs, which are used a lot more frequently in native English. You might be taught to say, "I don't understand," but a native speaker might say, "I don't get it." Or instead of "let's start," they'll say, "let's kick things off."
Segment 4, the role of slang and regional dialects.
Let's dive a bit deeper into slang and regional dialects. These are some of the most defining characteristics of native English that don't really show up in normal English.
Definitely. Slang can vary greatly even between different English-speaking countries. What's considered common slang in the US might not be used at all in the UK, Australia, or South Africa. For example, Americans might say, "That's awesome," while Brits might say, "That's brilliant," but they mean the same thing.
And then there are regional dialects within a single country. In the US, someone from the South might say, "y'all" for you all, while someone from New York might use phrases like "forget about it" for "forget about it." It's not just the words, but the pronunciation and intonation that change.
Yeah, and some slang terms can come and go with trends. What's considered cool slang today might sound outdated in a few years. Like, when was the last time you heard someone say, "That's groovy," or "radical"?
Good point. It's also interesting to see how new slang emerges from social media, music, and even memes. These influences shape native English in ways that traditional language learning doesn't keep up with.
Segment 5, how can learners bridge the gap?
Okay, so we've talked about what normal English and native English are, and why the differences exist. But the big question is, how can language learners bridge this gap? How can someone who's learned English in a classroom start sounding more like a native speaker?
Great question, Emily. I think one of the best ways to bridge that gap is through immersion. Watching movies, TV shows, and listening to podcasts in English, preferably without subtitles, can help learners get used to the natural flow of the language. It's one thing to read about a phrasal verb in a textbook, but it's another to hear it used in context by a native speaker.
Absolutely. Another tip is to practice speaking with native speakers as much as possible. There are language exchange programs and online communities where you can find native speakers who want to learn your language in exchange for helping you with English.
And don't be afraid to imitate native speakers. If you hear a phrase or slang term in a movie or podcast, try using it yourself. You might not get it perfectly at first, but that's okay. The more you use it, the more natural it will sound.
Another idea is to focus on learning idioms and slang phrases gradually. Don't try to memorize them all at once. Instead, pick a few that you hear often, understand their meaning, and then start incorporating them into your own conversations.
That's a good strategy. Also, keep in mind that it's not necessary to sound like a native speaker to be fluent. If you're communicating clearly and people understand you, that's what matters most.
Segment 6, common mistakes and misunderstandings.
Let's move on to some common mistakes or misunderstandings that occur because of these differences. One mistake I often see is when learners use formal English in casual situations. It can come across as stiff or overly polite.
Definitely, like using whom in a casual setting. While it's grammatically correct to say, "To whom should I speak?" you're more likely to hear, "Who should I talk to?" in everyday conversation. It's not technically correct, but it's how people speak.
Another one is misunderstanding the meaning of idioms or slang. For example, if someone says, "It's a piece of cake," they don't literally mean a slice of dessert. They mean it's easy. Sometimes learners will take expressions literally and get confused.
And there's also the issue of tone. In native English, tone can change the meaning of a word or phrase. Saying "okay" with a rising intonation can mean, "Are you sure?" whereas a flat "okay" just means agreement. It's subtle, but important.
Segment 7, how teachers can help.
For any English teachers out there, how can you help your students better understand the differences between normal and native English?
I think incorporating authentic materials, like news articles, songs, and movie clips, into your lessons can help a lot. It exposes students to how English is used in real life. You can also teach students about common idioms and slang, even if they're not technically correct English, because they're part of the language's evolution.
Role-playing common scenarios can also help, like ordering at a restaurant or having a casual conversation. It encourages students to use language in a practical way.
Segment 8. Continued deep dive into practical differences.
Let's dive a bit deeper into the practical differences between normal English and native English. It's not just about understanding vocabulary or grammar rules, it's about the context, intonation, and even body language that come into play when you're speaking or listening to native speakers.
Yeah, I think it's important to highlight that even if you understand all the words in a sentence, the way it's used in a native context might still be confusing. For instance, let's talk about phrasal verbs. These are really common in native English, but often get overlooked in traditional language learning.
Phrasal verbs are a perfect example. Take the verb give up. In normal English, you might just learn it means to quit. But in native English, you'll hear it used in many different ways. I give up, meaning I quit, or don't give up, meaning don't quit. You might also hear it in more specific phrases like give up on someone, which means to stop trying to help or change them.
And phrasal verbs often have multiple meanings depending on the context. For example, pick up could mean to lift something off the ground, to learn something quickly, or even to give someone a ride. It's these subtleties that make native English a bit more complex, but also more interesting.
Right, and this brings us to another key difference: conversational shortcuts. Native speakers often shorten phrases in ways that may not be immediately obvious to learners. You might hear gonna instead of going to, or wanna instead of want to. In formal English, this wouldn't be acceptable, but it's extremely common in spoken English.
It's like speaking a compressed version of English. There's also a lot of dropped sounds in native English. For instance, I'm going to often sounds like I'm gonna, and did you becomes didja. When you're listening to native English speakers, it can feel like words are running together because they're not pronounced the way you'd read them.
Let's get into some of the more nuanced aspects of native English, such as intonation, tone, and even nonverbal communication. These elements add layers of meaning that aren't always covered in traditional language lessons.
Absolutely. Intonation, for example, plays a huge role in expressing emotion or emphasis. In native English, saying, "Oh, really?" can mean different things based on how it's said. If it's said with a rising tone, it might indicate genuine interest or surprise. "Oh, really?" But if it's said with a flat or falling tone, it could indicate skepticism or even sarcasm. "Oh, really?"
And then there's tone, which can change the whole meaning of a word or phrase. For instance, if you say sure in a cheerful tone, it means agreement. But if you say sure with a bit of hesitation, it can imply doubt or reluctance.
Native speakers also use a lot of body language and facial expressions to communicate, sometimes without even realizing it. Nodding while saying, yeah, might indicate agreement, while shrugging and saying, I guess, could show uncertainty. These nonverbal cues can convey just as much meaning as the words themselves.
I agree, and that's something learners often miss out on if they only focus on the words themselves. In a textbook, you might learn thank you as a standard response to something nice, but in real life, a native speaker could say thanks, cheers, or even ta, especially in the UK, depending on the context and familiarity with the person.
Another nuance is sarcasm or humor. Native English speakers often use sarcasm, which involves saying the opposite of what you mean for comedic or emphatic effect. For example, if someone is late, you might say, "Oh, great, right on time," when you actually mean the opposite. This can be really tricky for non-native speakers to pick up on.
Segment 10. The influence of media and pop culture.
One major factor that shapes native English is media and pop culture. TV shows, movies, music, and even social media play a big role in introducing new slang, expressions, and even changes in pronunciation.
Yeah, and this is a part of why native English evolves so quickly. For example, think about phrases like Netflix and chill, which became popular through social media. If you're only learning English from a textbook, you're not going to come across phrases like that.
Or even words like selfie, binge watch, and ghosting. These terms have become common in everyday English because of their frequent use in social media and entertainment, but they might not even appear in some English dictionaries yet, depending on how new they are.
And then there's the impact of regional slang that goes mainstream through pop culture. For example, terms like lit or slay became popular across different English-speaking regions thanks to social media and music. These words might mean one thing in a dictionary but have taken on new meanings in popular culture.
It's also interesting how different English-speaking countries influence each other. An American might use a British expression like cheers to say thanks because they heard it in a movie or TV show. This blending of language across cultures makes native English a bit like a living language that keeps evolving. Let's address some common misconceptions about native English. One major misconception is that native English is correct English, and everything else is somehow wrong. In reality, language is fluid, and what's considered correct or appropriate depends on the context.
Right. People sometimes think if you don't speak like a native speaker, you're not fluent. But that's not true at all. Fluency is more about being able to communicate effectively and understand others, not about speaking perfectly.
And there's also the misconception that slang or informal language is bad English. It's not bad, it's just different. It serves a purpose in casual or familiar contexts. You wouldn't use slang in a business meeting, but it's perfectly fine with friends or on social media.
Another misconception is that all native speakers speak the same way. The truth is, there's a lot of variation depending on factors like age, region, and even social group. Someone from Scotland might sound completely different from someone in Texas or Australia.
Exactly. The way people speak English reflects their identity, background, and the culture they're a part of. It's why understanding different dialects and accents can give you a deeper insight into the diversity of English as a language.
Segment 12, Practical Tips for Learners.
So, how can learners improve their understanding of native English? Let's share some practical tips.
First off, exposure is key. Listen to English as much as you can, whether it's podcasts, TV shows, or even YouTube videos. The more you hear how native speakers talk, the more you'll start picking up on the nuances.
That's true. And don't just passively listen. Try to actively engage. If you're watching a show, pause and repeat phrases you hear. Try saying them out loud, mimicking the speaker's intonation and rhythm. It can help your pronunciation and make your speech sound more natural.
I also recommend keeping a notebook for interesting phrases or slang terms you come across. Look them up, understand their meanings, and try using them in your own conversations. You'll gradually build a more native-like vocabulary.
Good point, Emily. Another tip is to use language exchange apps like Tandem or HelloTalk, where you can chat with native speakers. They can give you feedback on how you're using certain expressions and teach you slang that you won't find in textbooks.
And don't be afraid to ask native speakers for clarification if you don't understand something. A lot of people are happy to explain slang or idioms. It can actually be a great way to make friends and learn more about the culture.
Finally, don't stress about sounding exactly like a native speaker. Your goal should be to communicate effectively and enjoy the learning process. Remember, even native speakers don't speak perfectly all the time.
Segment 13, Teachers' Approaches to Bridging the Gap.
For teachers who want to help students better understand native English, there are a few strategies you can implement. For instance, incorporating media like movie clips, song lyrics, or even social media posts in your lessons can expose students to real-life language usage.
Yeah, and you could also create exercises around common slang or phrasal verbs used in conversational English. Ask students to come up with their own sentences or dialogues using these expressions. It can help them see how these terms are applied in everyday situations.
Role-playing is another excellent tool. Create scenarios that mimic real-life interactions like making small talk, giving directions, or ordering food. It gives students a chance to practice native English in a controlled setting.
And encourage your students to listen to content that interests them. Whether it's podcasts on a hobby they love, YouTube channels, or even comedy shows, they're more likely to absorb and remember the language if it's something they enjoy.
Segment 14. The role of technology in learning native English.
Let's touch on the role of technology. Language learning apps, online courses, and digital content have made it easier than ever to learn native English. Tools like YouTube, Netflix, and even TikTok offer a constant stream of real-life language exposure.
Absolutely. Even social media platforms like Instagram and Twitter can be great for picking up slang and expressions. Following native speakers, celebrities, or influencers who speak English can give you daily exposure to how people talk casually.
And then there are language apps like Duolingo, Babbel, or Memrise that are incorporating more natural language elements into their lessons. They're not perfect, but they're trying to include more everyday phrases, which helps learners get familiar with how language is used in real-life situations.
Virtual language exchange programs and AI chatbots are also useful. You can practice speaking and writing in English with someone from another part of the world, and some chatbots are getting pretty good at mimicking natural language patterns.
Segment 15. The future of English learning.
As we look towards the future, I think English learning is going to continue to become more personalized and adaptive. Technology can already analyze a learner's speech and suggest improvements, but I think we'll see more AI-driven learning experiences that simulate conversations with native speakers.
Yeah, and language learning will probably incorporate more cultural elements. Instead of just learning vocabulary, students will be exposed to cultural nuances and context that influence how language is spoken. It's not just about knowing English, it's about understanding how and why it's used in certain ways.
And I think we'll see more integration of language with other subjects. For example, learning English through science videos, history documentaries, or cooking shows. It makes the process more immersive and less like studying.
Totally. The more ways you can bring language into your daily life, the more naturally you'll start using it. And that's really the goal, to make English an enjoyable part of your everyday experience.
Specific examples of normal versus native English expressions.
Let's break down some specific examples of how expressions differ in normal English versus native English. For instance, in normal English, you might learn the phrase, "How do you do?" as a formal way of greeting someone.
Yes, exactly. In native English, though, almost nobody uses "how do you do" anymore, unless they're joking or trying to be overly formal for fun. Instead, people might say, "How's it going?" or "What's up?" And even then, the expected response isn't to actually explain how things are going. It's just a casual way to greet someone.
Right, if someone says, "What's up?" you can just reply with, "Not much," "All good," or even the same phrase, "What's up?" It's not really an invitation to share all the details of your day.
Exactly. It's more of a social cue. This kind of language is part of what we call phatic communication, which is used to build rapport or acknowledge someone's presence, rather than exchange meaningful information. It's important for learners to recognize that these phrases aren't literal invitations to share detailed updates.
Another example could be the way native speakers use the word "like" in conversation. In normal English, you'd be taught to avoid unnecessary filler words, but in native English, "like" is commonly used as a filler, especially in informal settings. "I was like so surprised," or "it's like just around the corner."
And while some teachers might discourage using "like" too much, it's helpful for learners to understand that it's a natural part of spoken English. It can be used to soften statements or express uncertainty. So, hearing "like" doesn't always mean the person is being unclear. It's just part of how they speak casually.
How social settings influence language choice.
Let's discuss how the choice between normal and native English often depends on the social setting. In professional settings, for instance, you're more likely to hear structured, formal English. You wouldn't usually hear slang or informal expressions in a job interview.
That's true. In a business context, someone might say, "I'd like to discuss the current project status." It's direct and formal. But in an informal chat with a friend, the same idea could be expressed as, "Hey, what's going on with that project?" It's more casual and relaxed.
And even within professional settings, there can be variations. For example, tech companies often have a more relaxed culture, so you might hear more casual language than you would in a law firm or a bank.
Definitely. Understanding the social context is key to knowing which form of English to use. This extends to written communication as well. In an email to a friend, you could say, "Hey, just checking in. How's it going?" But in a business email, you'd write something like, "I hope you're doing well." I wanted to follow up on our previous conversation.
It's about matching the level of formality to the situation. Learners should practice switching between different levels of formality based on who they're talking to. The more you practice, the easier it becomes to adjust your language to fit the context.
The importance of listening skills in understanding native English.
Let's talk about listening skills. Understanding native English isn't just about recognizing words. It's also about catching the subtle differences in pronunciation, rhythm, and tone.
Yes, like how native speakers often link words together in sentences. For example, "what are you doing?" sounds more like "what you doing" when spoken quickly. If learners expect to hear each word distinctly, they might get confused when words are blended together like that.
And then there are contractions that aren't always taught in textbooks, such as I'd have for I would have. Native speakers use these contractions naturally, and they can make sentences sound more fluid but also more difficult to understand for learners.
One good way to improve listening skills is by watching TV shows or movies with subtitles in English. That way, you can hear how the words sound when spoken naturally and see them written out at the same time. You start to notice patterns in how certain words are pronounced in different contexts.
I also recommend podcasts, especially ones where the hosts have casual conversations. It's closer to how people actually talk. You can even slow down the playback speed to catch phrases and repeat them to yourself. It's a great way to train your ear to understand spoken native English.
And when you're listening, try to focus on the speaker's intonation. Pay attention to when their pitch rises or falls, as this can indicate emphasis or change the meaning of what's being said. It's not just about hearing the words, it's about understanding the underlying message.
Learning pronunciation and accent.
Let's shift gears and talk about pronunciation. For many learners, sounding like a native speaker seems like the ultimate goal, but it's important to remember that clear pronunciation is more important than having a perfect accent.
I agree. Native speakers come with all sorts of accents: British, American, Australian, Irish, you name it. So aiming for native-like pronunciation doesn't mean you need to sound like someone from a specific region.
And even within countries, there are so many regional accents. For example, someone from New York might sound different from someone in California. The same goes for the UK, where accents vary significantly between London, Liverpool, and Glasgow. Learners should focus on being understandable rather than perfect.
A practical tip for improving pronunciation is to record yourself speaking and then listen back. Compare your pronunciation to that of native speakers in audio clips or videos. This can help you identify sounds or intonation patterns you may need to work on.
You could also try shadowing, which is when you repeat what a native speaker says, mimicking their tone, rhythm, and intonation as closely as possible. It's a good way to practice not just pronunciation, but also the natural flow of speech.
And remember, having an accent is okay. It's part of who you are. The goal is to be clear and confident, not to erase your own unique way of speaking. Let's touch on idioms. They can be one of the trickiest parts of learning native English because their meanings often aren't obvious from the individual words.
True, like the expression kick the bucket, which means to die. If you took that literally, it wouldn't make much sense. Idioms often reflect cultural references or historical sayings, so they can be difficult to understand without some background knowledge.
And idioms can change meaning based on the context. For example, hit the books means to study hard, but hit the road means to leave or start a journey. It's not just the words themselves, but how they're used in a specific situation.
A good approach for learners is to start with the most common idioms. Phrases like break the ice, barking up the wrong tree, or a piece of cake come up a lot in everyday conversation. Learning these can make it easier to understand native English and even add some flavor to your own speech.
And don't just memorize them. Try using them in sentences. The more you practice, the more natural it becomes. You'll also get a feel for when an idiom is appropriate and when it's not.
Bridging cultural differences through language.
Language is not just about words, it's also about culture. Sometimes the way people speak reflects cultural norms, humor, or shared experiences. This is especially true for native English speakers.
That's right. For example, humor can be very different in English-speaking cultures. British humor tends to be more ironic or self-deprecating, while American humor often involves exaggeration. Understanding these cultural differences can help learners get jokes or references that might otherwise be confusing.
And even things like politeness vary. In some cultures, it's perfectly normal to be direct, but in English-speaking countries, people often soften their requests with phrases like, "Could you possibly?" or "Would you mind?" These kinds of expressions are important for sounding polite.
Another example is small talk, which is very common in English-speaking cultures. People often chat about the weather, sports, or recent events as a way to fill silence or start a conversation. It's not necessarily about exchanging important information, but about building rapport.
This is where cultural awareness becomes as important as language skills. Understanding why people say what they do can make your communication much more effective. For instance, knowing that asking, "How are you?" is more of a social courtesy than a genuine inquiry can help you respond appropriately.
Adapting to different varieties of English.
Let's not forget that English is a global language with many varieties. While we often focus on American or British English, there are many other forms, such as Australian English, Indian English, and South African English. Each has its own slang, pronunciation, and even grammar quirks.
Yes, and this can be confusing for learners. For example, in British English, you might hear flat for an apartment, while in American English, it's apartment. Or lorry in British English is truck in American English.
And then there's spelling. Words like color in American English are spelled color in British English. The differences don't usually cause problems in understanding, but they're good to be aware of, especially in writing.
Learners should aim to be flexible and adaptive. Exposure to different types of English can be beneficial. It not only helps you understand a wider range of speakers, but also makes you more versatile in your language skills.
It's about building a broad understanding of English while recognizing and appreciating the differences. You don't have to master every variety, but being familiar with a few will definitely enhance your communication skills.
The impact of media on learning native English.
Let's dive into how media influences the way people learn native English. Movies, TV shows, music, and social media are powerful tools for language acquisition. They expose learners to a wide range of accents, slang, idioms, and cultural references.
Yes, absolutely. For instance, shows like Friends or The Office are popular among English learners because they use conversational language that's close to everyday native English. The humor, the cultural references, and the dialogues all provide a great source of learning.
And don't forget about music. Lyrics can be a fun way to learn slang and informal expressions. Songs often use phrases that you wouldn't necessarily find in a textbook, but they're common in daily speech. Plus, music helps with remembering vocabulary because of the rhythm and melody.
Social media platforms like Instagram and Twitter also play a big role. They're filled with short, informal communication that reflects how people actually talk. It's a great way to learn current slang and keep up with language trends.
Yeah, even memes can be educational. They often involve wordplay or cultural jokes that give insights into language and society. If you can understand a meme, you're not just learning English, you're also picking up cultural nuances.
Common mistakes learners make when transitioning from normal to native English.
Let's talk about some common mistakes learners make when moving from normal English to native English. One big one is translating directly from their native language. This often leads to awkward phrasing because English sentence structures and expressions can be very different.
Yes, like using literal translations of idioms. For example, in some languages, people say something equivalent to "I am heating the ear" to mean "I'm listening." If you directly translate that into English, it wouldn't make any sense.
Another common mistake is overusing formal phrases in casual settings. If you say, "I would like to kindly request your assistance," when asking a friend for help, it sounds overly stiff. In informal English, you'd just say, "Hey, can you help me out?" It's much more natural.
Misusing slang is another issue. Learners sometimes use slang without fully understanding its meaning or appropriateness in certain situations. Slang can be regional, age-specific, or even out of date. Just because you heard it in a movie doesn't mean it's commonly used today.
And watch out for false friends, words that look similar in English and another language but have different meanings. For example, the word actual in English means real or existing, but in some languages, a similar-looking word means current. These differences can be tricky.
It's important for learners to be patient and accept that mistakes are part of the process. The key is to learn from them and keep practicing. Don't be afraid to ask native speakers to clarify if you're unsure about how to use certain words or phrases.
How different professions use English differently.
Let's look at how English varies across different professions. In the tech industry, you'll hear a lot of jargon like debug, push code, or cloud computing. It's almost like a different language because of all the technical terms.
Yes, and in law, you'll encounter phrases like due diligence, habeas corpus, or pro bono. The vocabulary is specific to the field and often includes Latin phrases or terms that have a legal history. It can be overwhelming for learners who aren't familiar with the terminology.
The medical field is another area where specialized language is common. Words like intravenous, hypertension, or diagnostic imaging are used frequently, and they're not terms you'd usually come across in everyday conversation.
Business English has its own set of phrases as well, such as synergy, scalable, or ROI, return on investment. It's not just about knowing the words, but also understanding the context in which they're used. For example, saying, "let's touch base," means to get in contact and discuss something rather than literally touching a base.
For learners, it's helpful to focus on the vocabulary and phrases related to their field of interest or profession. That way, they can quickly improve their language skills in a way that's relevant to their needs.
Learning English through storytelling.
Storytelling is a powerful way to learn English, especially native English. Stories naturally introduce you to a wide range of vocabulary, grammatical structures, and cultural contexts.
Absolutely. When you listen to or read stories, you're not just learning the words, but also understanding how they're used in different scenarios. It helps you see the language in action, which is a lot more engaging than just memorizing lists of words.
And stories often include dialogue, which shows how people actually talk. You get to see the rhythm of conversations, how characters express emotions, and the use of casual versus formal language. It's almost like being part of a real conversation.
Even traditional fairy tales or children's books can be beneficial for adult learners because they use simple language to convey stories. As you progress, you can move on to more complex stories or even audiobooks, which provide listening practice along with the language learning.
I'd also recommend trying to write your own stories in English. It doesn't have to be a novel, just a short story or even a journal entry can help. Writing helps reinforce the vocabulary and grammar you've learned, and you can also use it to experiment with more expressive language.
Code switching and mixing languages.
Let's touch on code switching, which is when bilingual or multilingual speakers switch between languages within a conversation. It's pretty common among people who are fluent in more than one language.
Yes, it's interesting because code switching can happen for various reasons. Sometimes it's because there isn't an exact equivalent in one language for what you're trying to express, so you switch to the other. Other times it's used for emphasis or to convey a certain tone.
In English, you often hear phrases borrowed from other languages, especially in multicultural societies. For example, someone might say, "let's meet for a cafe," instead of "let's meet for coffee," using the French word for coffee.
Mixing languages isn't always a bad thing, but it's important to be aware of your audience. If you're speaking with someone who doesn't understand the other language, you could accidentally exclude them from the conversation.
And it's worth noting that while mixing languages might feel natural for multilingual speakers, in some formal settings, it's better to stick to one language to avoid confusion. The key is knowing when and where it's appropriate.
Motivation and mindset for learning native English. Let's talk about mindset. Learning a language can be a long and sometimes frustrating journey, but having the right mindset can make all the difference.
Definitely. It's important to focus on progress, not perfection. There will be times when you feel like you're not improving, or you get stuck on a certain aspect of the language. That's completely normal. Language learning is not a linear process.
And don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's through mistakes that we learn the most. The more you practice, the better you'll become at catching and correcting them. The important thing is to keep pushing yourself out of your comfort zone.
Setting small, achievable goals can help maintain motivation. Instead of saying, "I want to be fluent in English," try setting goals like, "I'll watch one movie in English this week without subtitles," or "I'll have a 5-minute conversation with a native speaker."
And celebrate your milestones, no matter how small. It could be as simple as understanding a joke in English or being able to give directions. Every step counts, and recognizing your progress helps keep the momentum going.
Understanding nonverbal communication in English-speaking cultures.
Let's not forget about nonverbal communication. In English-speaking cultures, body language, facial expressions, and gestures play a significant role in communication.
Yes, like making eye contact. In many English-speaking cultures, maintaining eye contact is seen as a sign of confidence and attentiveness. Avoiding eye contact might be interpreted as a sign of dishonesty or lack of interest.
Gestures can also differ from one culture to another. For example, in the US, giving a thumbs up means approval or agreement. But in some cultures, the same gesture could be considered rude.
Even the concept of personal space varies. In English-speaking countries, people tend to stand a little further apart when talking compared to some other cultures. If you stand too close, it might make the other person uncomfortable.
Understanding these cultural norms can help learners communicate more effectively and avoid misunderstandings. It's not just about the words you say, but how you say them and how you present yourself.
The role of humor in native English.
Humor is another fascinating aspect of native English. It often involves wordplay, cultural references, or sarcasm, which can be challenging for learners.
Yes, sarcasm in particular can be confusing because the words mean the opposite of what the speaker intends. For example, if it's raining heavily and someone says, "Oh, great weather we're having," they're obviously being sarcastic.
And then there's British humor, which tends to be more understated or dry. It might involve subtle irony or self-deprecation, which can be hard to detect if you're not familiar with the cultural context. And then there's British humor, which tends to be more understated or dry. It might involve subtle irony or self-deprecation, which can be hard to detect if you're not familiar with the cultural context. Finally, let's talk about immersion. Even if you're not living in an English-speaking country, there are ways to immerse yourself in the language.